Hi, welcome back to the podcast, HOA Hell. I'm your host, Michael Kushner, and with me, as always, is Senior Associate from MBK Chapman, Sam Kill. Sam, good morning.
Good morning, Mike. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. Sam, today, as you know, we're going to be talking about an issue that is probably one of the most common causes or sources of disputes between homeowners, especially homeowners in connected housing like condominiums and townhomes, and their HOAs. And that is water intrusions or water leaks.
Massive issue.
Okay. I would venture to say that most people living in California HOAs at one point or another have had some sort of water intrusion, regardless of cause. It just either water coming in through the roof or through a window, something in the sealant, or a pinhole pipe or a pinhole leak in a pipe or something. We've all experienced some sort of water intrusion.
Right.
When the water intrusion, though, is coming from a common area source or in the case of connected housing where you might require the cooperation of the HOA, that sort of thing, that's kind of the breeding ground for the types of disputes we're going to talk about.
Right.
This podcast is because of the amount of detail that is just part and parcel with this issue, and because, as you know, people that listen to our podcast know that we don't handle things superficially in our podcast. We are really complete in how we approach problems and how we discuss what the law is in California and what homeowners can do to resolve the types of disputes we talk about. We don't take shortcuts and we don't do things in 10 or 15-minute blocks. We are detailed and we cover all the nuances, and that's what separates us from other podcasts. We cover the nuances because we know the law. And so we're going to do this in two parts. Okay?
Sounds good.
This is going to be a two-part episode. And so when we finish with today's part, I'll kind of give you a signpost as to what we're going to do next. But when the long and the short of it is when water enters your home, a lot of homeowners automatically assume, and I understand why, they assume that the HOA is going to be responsible for the repairs and replacement of not only the real property, but also the personal property, especially if it's coming in from a roof or from an exterior wall or some sort of HOA common area, okay? And on the other side, so that's what homeowners often assume, and on the other side, a lot of HOAs, and most especially bad HOAs or badly managed HOAs, kind of default to telling homeowners to just go through your own insurance. Just use your insurance. Go report to your insurance, even though that's not even the beginning of the analysis that needs to be done. That's the improper.
A reflexive answer that you get all the time.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about the other kinds of reflexive answers that bad HOAs will say. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about, homeowners are responsible for everything that's walls in or studs in. And that's also not true. Okay. Because both reactions are just wrong, okay? So in this two-part episode, or at least we've designed this two-part episode to give you a practical, legally grounded framework for handling any water intrusion events that occurred in the context of your HOA, okay? Our goal with this episode, therefore, is to help you understand a few things, okay? And when I say episode, I'm talking about both parts 1 and part 2. Okay. Number 1, our goal is to help you understand how to determine who's responsible for repairs and who's liable for damage to property, real property and personal property. And we're going to define those later. Okay. Our goal is to help you understand where bad HOAs most often get things wrong, and also implicitly where homeowners often get things wrong. Our goal is to help you understand how to recognize and reject oversimplified answers that are most commonly given by bad HOAs or boards or management companies. And finally, how to avoid the mistakes that could either weaken your position or cost you more money. Okay? That's the overall goal for the two episodes. So at the end of our two-part series on water intrusions and HOAs, I'm hoping that we've addressed those four things. Okay? Now, I'll give a disclaimer. Most of what we're going to discuss in part 1 and part 2 of our water intrusion episodes are going to apply to connected housing. And what I mean by connected housing is, for the most part, condominiums or townhomes or even co-ops, okay, converted apartments type thing. Anything with shared walls, shared ceilings, or a combination of those, okay? Less likely to be as relevant to people who live in single-family homes. However, that being said, and we'll get to this a little bit later, there are lots of single-family home situations or clients that we have, for example, live in single-family homes where the water intrusion came from common area landscape watering, let's say, that an overwatering situation, and water eventually seeped through into the foundation and started percolating up into the floorboards or the floors of our clients. And those are single-family homes, but there was liability there. So it is relevant to single-family homes, but the most relevant most of the episodes are going to be relevant to the connected housing. Okay? That's just kind of the way it is. Now, in part 1, today's episode, we're going to focus on 3 primary things. Okay? We're going to focus on classification, determining what type of property was involved in the water intrusion. So we're going to classify the 3 types of property and what we mean by classifications. The second issue we're going to cover today is points of origin. And the third issue we're going to cover today is the core legal framework at play when water intrusions or water leaks occur, including what the default rules are in the statutes, how those can be changed by the CC&Rs, and how negligence or willful misconduct can change the damages analysis. Okay, so that's going to be kind of the third broad topic today. In part 2, we'll focus on insurance, different kinds of insurance that are most commonly involved and what those mean. Although we will mention insurance today, it won't be a primary focus. In the next one, we're going to cover relocation costs, where those are necessary, and how what the statute says as a default and how that can sometimes shift based on conduct or CC&Rs. We're going to talk about when water intrusion causes mold. We're going to talk about the different aspects of mold remediation and what to do in cases of that, of mold, and basically what the mold standards are in California. We're going to cover what happens when the HOA delays, denies, or gets things wrong. And lastly, once a bad HOA does get things wrong, what are the most common causes of action that we as HOA lawyers use to force HOAs to comply with the law or the governing documents in water intrusion cases? And we're going to go and briefly discuss those. So that'll be next time, okay? So with that out of the way, let's start with kind of our part 1 today. And you're going to help me with this.
Sure.
Okay? Before getting into the meats and potatoes about water intrusion, I thought it would be very helpful, because we're going to be using a lot of terms, a lot of words and phrases that are relevant to the water intrusion analysis. And I thought it would be good to define our terms at the beginning. Now, I'm going to define several terms today. I'm also going to, in a few minutes, or it might have already popped up, depends how our producer does things, there'll be a graphic on your screen for a very short period of time that'll show the people that are watching the video, that'll kind of show them all the terms we're going to define. I am also going to take this graphic with the defined terms that we discuss in the podcast, and I'm going to make it available to anybody on our website. So all you're going to have to do, if you'd like to go and see this graphic, is go to mbkchapman.com, go over to the Libraries tab, scroll down to Fact Sheets, and click on Fact Sheets. And I will have, even though it's not a traditional fact sheet, I will find a way of putting a copy of this graphic in a fact sheet and make that available to you, okay? So with that out of the way, let's define our terms. Now, the terms are not going to appear in any order. They're not alphabetized, and they're not in order of importance. They're just kind of random, okay? So Sam, I'll let you start with the first one.
Okay.
In the context of our episode on water intrusion, what do I mean by a homeowner's separate interest?
Mike, separate interest pertains to the portion of the property that's owned by the homeowner and in connection with connected housing and condominiums. This would be the interior of the unit, or in other words, walls in.
Or studs in, yeah.
Studs in, and that constitutes the separate interest property.
Exactly. And that's basically, this is what the homeowner owns. And it's always going to be defined somewhere in either the CC, it's going to be in the CC&Rs. Mm-hmm. CC&Rs will always describe or define what constitutes an owner's separate interest.
Exactly.
Okay? Mm-hmm. All right. So that's good. Now, the next one is common area. I'll take that one. Okay. So the common area is also going to be described in the CC&Rs, mm-hmm. probably in around the same place. Right. And basically, the common area are the parts of the property in the HOA that's owned by the HOA. Now, that could be a little different in a co-op. It might be owned by a corporation. But when I say owned by the HOA, I mean that to be very broad. Okay. Right. So whether it's through a corporation or everybody owns a separate piece, it doesn't matter. That's what I mean. Mm-hmm. So it's the part that's not owned by you. So using his parlance, it's studs out mm-hmm. or walls out.
Right.
Okay. So in connected housing, that'll be the roof, the exterior walls, maybe the piping on the inside of the walls that feeds multiple units, landscaping, private roads, all that stuff. The stuff that's owned by the HOA. Okay. And then the third item is exclusive use common area. Tell me what that is, Sam.
Well, in short, Mike, that's a blend. It's technically, as described in most CC&Rs, a common area component, but it's exclusive in nature because it only services a particular unit. So this could be a balcony, a patio, right. Something that's Perfect. Specific to where you have access to it
right.
within your unit. However, it's actually owned
right.
equally by the entire membership.
Right. So exclusive use common area is considered common area in that it's owned by the HOA, but it services or is used by only one particular homeowner. And the best two examples that we have, although it could, garages could be included in certain mm-hmm. concepts. Now, not in a single family home, the garage would be yours, but I could see garages, but mostly patios or balconies are what we think of the most. Other homeowners can't access your balcony because the only way to get to your balcony would be to go through your unit or put a ladder up on the outside and crawl up. So although the balcony might be owned by the HOA, it's your exclusive use. Okay, again, defined by the CC&Rs. The next one is maintenance. What do we mean by maintenance? Well, we always talk in many episodes, we've talked about HOA obligations and homeowner obligations to maintain, repair, replace common area components. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what we mean. Okay, so maintenance refers to routine care intended to keep a component functioning in its best capacity or to prevent deterioration.
Right.
Okay, so maintenance it's kind of an obvious term, but I felt it was necessary. Mm-hmm. Okay, repairs a little bit different. Repairs are what?
Repairs would be a step beyond mere maintenance. In repair, you can repair parts, for instance.
Fix something that's broken.
So some components and part of it to extend the shelf life, essentially.
Right. So you're fixing a component that's failed or is no longer
functionality.
Is no longer functioning as intended. Okay. Yeah. Replacement is it's when you replace a component, and that could be because it's at the end of its useful life. It could be because something destroyed it. So, to the point where it's beyond repair, so it needs to be replaced, stuff like that. Okay, real subtle differences, but they're real differences, and I think most people already kind of have a sense of that. Mm-hmm. The next term I want to define is real property. Okay, now real property I'm defining in terms of or as opposed to separate or personal property. Let's call it that, personal property. So real property is permanently attached property. It's what we think of when we think of land or a house, okay? It's something that is permanently attached. Now, that will include, in many cases, fixtures that are permanently attached. But broadly speaking, when we talk about real property, we're talking about structure. We're talking about, the roof, the drywall, the foundation, balcony. That's real property, okay? It's part of the structure of the unit. It's built in, okay? As opposed to personal property, which is what you would consider your stuff. Your area rugs, your piano, your antiques, your heirlooms, your pictures, your artwork, your couches, your TV, your CD collection, your records, things that it's your stuff. When you move,
movable objects, yeah.
Yeah, when you move, you pack them up and you take them in a truck and you go to your new house and you take them with you. You don't take your drywall with you. You don't take your roof with you when you move. You don't pack up the balcony. Okay, you take your stuff on the inside. So that's what we mean by personal property. That the difference between real property and personal property is going to matter in this episode a lot. So that's why we're defining them here. Tell me in 30 seconds or less what an HO6 insurance policy is.
Yeah, HO6 insurance policies are coverages pertaining to specifically condominiums and townhomes where a homeowner gets that policy, and it's intended to be a supplemental policy to the association's master coverage.
Right, exactly. Okay, they are highly recommended, if not required, in some governing documents, but in many they're not. But highly recommended if you live in a townhome that's classified as a condo, or you live in a condo, it would or even a townhome that isn't classified as a condo but might be classified as a single-family home, it would behoove you to have an HO6 policy. Now, single-family homes, you don't have HO6 policies. Okay, now. As Sam said, that's a differentiator from another kind of policy we're going to talk about, which is the association's master policy. And again, in these two cases of HO6 and master, we're talking about connected housing. Okay, the master policy is the HOA's insurance policy, and that typically covers common area components and to the extent the HOA has responsibility for repair, maintenance, or replacement. And we're going to discuss that based on statutory requirements in a few minutes. But to the extent it covers any of that for exclusive use common area, it would cover those as well. And that would also depend on policy language. So basically, that's the HOA's insurance policy, okay? Now, next, we kind of hinted at studs in or walls in versus studs out or walls out. Give me a 15, 20-second explanation of that to supplement what you already said.
Basically, studs in, walls in would constitute the interior of the unit. So anything with
where your paint is.
With a wall to the interior, correct. And basically the reverse of that would be walls out, which would be the interior behind the walls, right?
So the best way to divide line, even though it's a millimeters or even not, maybe not even plural millimeters,
it really
depending on how much paint you have, but millimeter thick dividing line is everything where you can see the gray or the white or the whatever color paint you're used, wherever you can see the paint, that's your walls in. Everything on the other side of your paint could be walls out, maybe sometimes behind the drywall, depending on, again, what the governing documents say. But that's what we mean by that, okay? Next is water intrusion or water leak. I think that's pretty obvious, but I figured what the hell. Anytime water is making its way into a part of your property where it's not supposed to be, it's not its natural pathway, or it's making its way into your property because of some defect in some component like a pipe or a roof or whatever, that's what we mean by water intrusion or water leak. When you turn on the faucet of your bathtub and you put in a stopper, that's not a water intrusion or water leak. You turned on the water and the water's supposed to be coming out that tap and it's supposed to fill up that container. But if the water's coming out of your ceiling or from a chandelier or dripping down your walls or coming in from the side of a window or is coming up through the floorboards or even where the coming up through the actual floor itself, that's not where water is supposed to normally come from unless you have a stream in your house. So that would be a water intrusion or water leak, okay? Next is mitigation. I'll define that one and you'll define deductible in a minute. Okay. So mitigation is a fancy word for it's a concept in the law which describes the reasonable steps that a party, either you, the HOA, or whatever, or a neighbor, has to take to limit or minimize damage that's occurred. Some sort of something occurred, and to prevent further damage or further deterioration, you got to mitigate. You got to do something to stop the whatever's happening so that it doesn't make things worse. That's what mitigation means in context of our conversation.
Containment reduction, yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Deductible. Talking about insurance, what's a deductible?
Deductible would be the portion of an insurance payment or towards an insurance claim payment when you tender a claim to either of the insurance carriers, whether it's under your HO6 for your homeowner's policy or whether it constitutes the HOA tendering to their insurance carrier. They would pay a initial upfront deductible in connection with that claim.
Right. So to make that even more simple, it's the part of when you make a claim on your insurance, it's the part that you have to pay out of pocket before insurance starts cutting you checks.
Right.
That's the deductible. And then lastly is what we're going to call allocation. And allocation's basically based on what the governing documents in conjunction with the Davis-Sterling Act say regarding responsibility for repairs, payments, or damage or losses. So how those components or items are allocated, who's responsible, that's what we mean by allocation, okay? Now, those are the words we're going to use today. And so hopefully you'll be able to follow a little more smoothly what we're talking about. So now we get to really start. 3 buckets that control responsibility. So we're going to start with responsibility, okay? All water intrusion events, and again, we define that term, so it's not putting on your bathtub, that's natural. All water intrusion events start with classification. That's the most important thing. That's the first step you do is classification.
Huge.
Okay?
Yep.
What do we mean by classification? Simply put, as we said a minute ago, it relates to determining the types of property that are involved in the water intrusion. Where did it emanate from? Where did it originate from? Or what did it damage? Either one. They have to be classified. Okay? Because you cannot analyze who's responsible for repair, replacement, or who's responsible for damage until you've classified what's been affected. Is this part of the homeowner's separate interest? Is it part of the common area? Is it part of exclusive use common area? You have to classify it into one of those 3 categories, okay? So there are 3 classifications. I just said them.
Yep.
Separate interest, common areas, and exclusive use common areas. Now, if your CC&Rs discuss who's responsible for repair, maintenance, or replacement of any of those things, separate interest, common areas, or exclusive use common areas, then your CC&Rs will control. They will supersede the default provision set forth in the Davis-Sterling Act. And today we're only going to be talking about one code section of the Davis-Sterling Act, and that's 4775. So when in doubt, we're talking about Civil Code 4775 today, okay? So if you're, and I'm talking only CC&Rs here, if your CC&Rs say, whatever your CC&Rs say about responsibility for repair, replacement, or maintenance of common area, separate interests, or exclusive use common area, then that's going to be what controls. In the absence of a statement in your CC&Rs regarding those issues, the statute 4775, the statute's default provisions will control. Okay? So, very simple. Now, we've talked about classification. You got to classify where did the leak originate, and we'll go into origin soon. We're going to cover that again. But where did it originate, or what did it damage? There's two sides to that coin.
Right.
Next issue is what I just said we talk about later. We're talking about now. Point of origin. Okay? That, once you've classified what's been affected, now you have to say, okay, where did this leak originate from?
The source, yeah.
It doesn't matter where the leak manifests. When you look up on your ceiling and see a roof leak, and I've had several in the last couple of years. Fortunately, they were real easy to fix. They were simple little things that needed to be, the roof guy got up there, did some little thing with a tar paper or whatever, or fixed the tile, whatever, and it was easy to solve. But when you see that, it doesn't mean that it originated then. Anybody originated there. Anybody that understands how water works knows that water will find its most natural and easiest path, just like lightning, okay? Water will find whatever path it needs to find based on gravity and other laws of physics and make its way down, okay? So that could take unique and interesting routes that don't give you any clue as to where it originated. So origin is massively important, okay? So once you've completed the classifications that we talked about, you have to direct your attention to the most important thing, which is what was the origin source for this water intrusion? To be clear, source of water does matter more than the damages, okay? It matters more because you can't figure out the second part, the damages issue, without knowing the origin, because the origin is almost unilaterally responsible for determining who's responsible for damage, with some exceptions, which we will talk about today at the end, okay? So, for example, a failed roof is different from a neighbor's overflowing bathtub.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? If the origin's a failed roof, it's going to be a very different scenario or outcome than if it was from your neighbor putting their stopper in their bathtub, setting themselves a bubble bath, and then getting a phone call and being distracted. And all of a sudden, 40 minutes later, there's water pouring. You know, they go downstairs and get comfortable on the couch, talk to their Aunt Marge, and then all of a sudden they see water starting to come through the chandelier of their first floor. It's coming from that water that is long since overflown and gone everywhere. Okay? A broken common area pipe behind the wall is going to be different from pipe that services your unit only, which is probably going to be considered part of your separate interest. And heavy rain doesn't end the inquiry, because whether if heavy rain comes in and causes a water intrusion, the question then becomes, okay, where did it come from and how did it originate there? If it was because of failure to maintain, then that's one thing. But if it was from a lightning struck a tree, which caused an opening in the roof, and then the heavy rain came through the roof, well, that's a different scenario as well. Okay, so origin's important. If you cannot identify, and I can't think of a case where this is the case. Experts can always identify, but let's say you couldn't identify the point of origin, then you can't determine who's responsible for repairs, and you won't be able to determine who's responsible for any damage to your stuff or your real property. Okay, so once we've got classification, we've got point of origin. Next is the statute, 4775.
Yeah.
Okay, so 4775, which is part of the Davis-Sterling Act, supplies the default maintenance, repair, and replacement responsibilities for HOAs and homeowners. Okay, and so to start, we're going to assume, as we discussed, because I want to focus on the statute. Do you want to cover what I'm going to assume here?
Sure.
What do you think I'm going to assume?
Well, the logical assumption here.
Just for this discussion of the statute.
The assumption is that your CC&Rs are silent, which is rarely the case. They usually
Almost
do.
never.
One of the terms that we use is allocate, the designation of who's responsible for what. But let's assume, for our purposes here for the statute, that the CC&Rs are silent, do not speak to the issue. So
At all.
Under those circumstances, the statute here.
Well, don't go into the statute yet. I just wanted you to tell me the assumption.
That's the assumption.
Okay?
Yeah.
So, in other words, as Sam just said, we are going to assume for the purposes of our discussion of 4775 that your CC&Rs is one of those very, very few that is silent as to responsibility for common areas or exclusive use common areas or separate interests. Again, that's almost never, if not always, that's never going to be the case, but
Never seen it, yeah.
I haven't seen it, but I'm just so I can isolate the statute.
It's a thought exercise, yeah.
It's a thought exercise. Thank you. So let's pretend for a minute that your CC&Rs are remarkably silent on what defining those three things, or who's responsible for what. Okay? Here's what the statute says. Separate interest, your stuff, your everything, walls in, studs in, your stuff. Okay? You're responsible for that. That's the statute. Okay? Exclusive use common area, I'm going to do last. Let's go to common area. HOA, responsible. For repair, maintenance, and replacement of common area components, it's HOA. For repair, maintenance, and replacement of separate interest components, it's you. Now, exclusive use common area, that hybrid that we talked about. Statute's actually interesting there. Homeowner, default position in the law, homeowner responsible for maintenance of exclusive use common areas, HOA responsible for repairs and replacements. So that's why I defined those terms before. You would be responsible for maintaining, they would be responsible for repairing, replacing. Okay? Now, as Sam and I both made very clear, the statute is almost never going to control, because I can't think of a set of CC&Rs that I've seen in the last several years that didn't have at least some sort of allocation of those three things. Now, it is fair to say that CC&Rs routinely handle it differently. Some CC&Rs say much less on the subject, so more default. Some only counter the default with, like they'll shift, they'll say for exclusive use common area, the HOA will take care of maintenance, replacement, and repairs, in which case you're altering the default by taking maintenance out of that homeowner hands. Sometimes that does happen because it's just easier for the HOA to take care of exclusive use common area, right?
Well, I haven't seen this, Mike, but the conceivable scenario where this may come up foreseeably is in small associations.
Very small. Like, what do you mean by that? Under 10?
Under 10, perhaps sometimes under 20 that are not well organized. The governing documents are sloppy. And then in some cases, you may not even have CC&Rs. You may have a tenancy in common agreement or something to that effect. And I could see that there would not be something that would actually supersede 4775.
You're right. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Now, let's clarify something. We were talking about 4775 in our thought exercise, and then we corrected it with real life.
Yeah.
But what we just talked about doesn't answer who pays. We haven't even covered this. who pays for damage to the classifications we just discussed. Repairs and replacements are separate from liability for damages. We're going to get to that separately later, so don't get confused. Okay, we're still on the who's responsible part right here, not for damages. Okay, so the next issue, now that we're just working our way through in a logical order, I think the next issue is it leads us to the 3 questions that homeowners like you have to make sure you keep separate in your mind. There's the 3 questions that are important in our analysis here that I want you to keep separate. They're separate questions. Okay, I'll tell you what. I'm gonna make a change right now, and I'm gonna consolidate them into 2.
Okay.
It's not 3 questions. It's 2 questions. I just saved you time and made this easier. Question 1 asks, who must repair the failed component? Mm-hmm. Simple. Okay. Question 2 asks, who is liable to me or to the HOA, depending on the circumstances, for the resulting damage caused by the water? Okay. That's the one I combined. So who is responsible for the resulting damage caused by the water intrusion? It's the second question. Those 2 questions are critical, and they are separate, as I just said a second ago. Okay. So let's now move on, keeping those questions in mind. Let's go with a negative here. Let's talk about when the HOA is not automatically responsible. Okay? Contrary to what you may have heard from others who have a superficial understanding of the Davis-Sterling Act, or superficial understanding of California HOA law, even when water comes from a common area component, that fact alone does not make the HOA liable for or responsible for every loss, for all damages. Okay? And a lot of those other non-nuanced, superficial knowledge or non-experts in HOA law talk very broadly sometimes about, well, if the origin is from a common area, then the HOA is going to be responsible for your damage, for your property damage. But they don't differentiate whether they're talking about real property or personal property. They don't differentiate whether or not the CC&Rs might say something different, or whether they're relying on the default in 4775. That's the sort of thing that makes it very difficult for listeners, let's say, of another podcast to understand what's being said, because they're being fed such generalized, hogwash.
Yeah, so that lack of nuance, and I see this in practice too, that lack of nuance in that legal analysis also really amplifies and perpetuates this very common misconception and the assumptions that homeowners come with. And then on top of that, if they have a source of authority that they...
Supposed authority.
Supposed authority that they look into, and that is not really being nuanced enough or layered enough, that can really amplify that issue.
As I said at the beginning of this podcast episode, the reason we don't have 10 or 12-minute episodes, I have shorts that are a minute and a half, but I cover discrete issues, right? The reason we don't cover a broad and very important broad topic like this, which is, more than enough for a 2-part episode that together will be more than an hour, is because you can't adequately handle this kind of issue in 12 to 15 minutes. It's actually just absurd. And what you're going to get from something like that is just useless drivel. So I say that as a public service announcement. Let's move on though. So if the leak comes from, if the origin is an HOA component, it's very likely the HOA is going to have responsibility to fix the component.
Right.
That's not what we're talking. That is a truism. Okay. But interior finishes, personal property, i.e. non-fixtures, involve other factors. Insurance, your insurance policy, whether negligence or willful misconduct is a factor, what your governing documents say as to things like fixtures, which are often part of, and what I mean by that is I say you upgrade your cabinets or you upgrade your floors. That's part of the real property because it's a fixed. But so it isn't technically personal property, but the HOA might not be responsible for that. That depends on your governing documents. Those are the kind of things that shift the analysis. And those are, the devil's in those details, folks. The devil's in those details. Now, so we've talked about just now, so the HOAs are not going to be automatically responsible even if it's a common area component. We'll get into when they are and when they're not in a few minutes, okay? Let's go with another major myth. The first myth being HOA is responsible if it's common area. That's not true. The next one is the studs in or walls in myth, okay? And what I call the document reality. And what I mean by document is I'm talking about your CC&Rs, okay? One of the most common things that bad HOAs do in water intrusion cases, and I'm generalizing here, but is that they, and I'm talking about water intrusion cases in connected housing, okay? Is they promulgate or they popularize or they spread a shorthand phrase as if they were legal rules. And that is HOA is responsible for studs in, or HOA is responsible for studs out, and homeowners are responsible for studs in. Because it's easy to memorize, it's easy to say, and it's a simple concept that can be grasped. But that is hopefully simplistic.
And it's recycled over and over again, typically by management at the behest of the board.
Just
because in one instance that seemed to apply and backed by legal counsel, and then they just recycle it.
Once in a while, it does apply because the governing documents might say so. The point is, the bad HOAs use that as a shorthand, as a way of skipping the required analysis, okay? Now, we're responsible for studs out, you're responsible for studs in. That might sound, especially from a manager, that might sound very authoritative and official, but it's not what the law says. Those are shortcuts that are relied on because they're easy.
Well, they're bypassing a whole analysis.
And shortcuts are dangerous in water intrusion cases. Studs in and walls in is not, or studs out and walls out, either way, is not a universal rule. It's not found in the Davis-Sterling Act. It is nowhere to be found in Civil Code 4775. It only matters if your governing documents or insurance policies expressly adopt that framework. If they do, then in your case, that might be true. It's not always wrong, but it depends on more than just studs in, studs out. Okay, that's just wrong. What actually controls is this sequence, and it should always be followed in this order. So I'm going to give you the legal sequence of events, okay? First, identify how the CC&Rs define the boundaries between your separate interest, common area, and exclusive use common area, okay? Some CC&Rs define separate interests as everything inside the unfinished drywall, and others define it as everything that's inside finished surfaces. Upgraded built-ins and flooring might be included there, okay? Others define it by reference to structural elements, and very few, almost never, none, will not define it at all. Whatever the case is, in your situation, the words matter, okay? That's the first thing to do. Step number 2 is you determine, once you've decided how they allocate that or how they define, you now determine how the CC&Rs allocate responsibility for maintenance, repair, and or replacement for each category. Separate, exclusive use, common area. Those 3 categories, okay? These words are not interchangeable. Maintenance is very different. That's why we defined it. Maintenance is different than repair. Repairs and maintenance are different than replacement, okay? Many disputes arise because boards collapse those 3 concepts, okay, into a single idea and assign it to the homeowner. Hence the shortcut, walls in, you're responsible. Okay? And third and last, only if the CC&Rs are silent or ambiguous do you look to the default rules that we discussed before in Civil Code 4775. And even then, I'll say this again, I said it before, even then, 4775 addresses who must repair or replace those components. It doesn't automatically determine who pays for interior damage. In other words, let's assume for a minute that your HOA is 1 in a million that says nothing about those classifications, meaning that the default rules in 4775 apply. Let's assume that's the case here. All that tells you is who's going to be responsible for repair or replacement. It has nothing to do with damage. Damage to your Aunt Marge's armoire, to your carpet, to your floors, to your built-ins, or whatever, okay? And that's why shorthand explanations are dangerous, right? You agree?
Absolutely.
A bad HOA may be correct in saying that it's not responsible for maintaining interior finishes. They often aren't. But let's say we're talking about common area component. Okay, let's say we're talking about, in a condo, we're talking about the roof. Okay? let's say the CC&Rs don't transfer, and with a roof, they almost never will because it's not feasible. But let's say, whatever it is, let's say the CC&Rs don't transfer responsibility for maintenance, repair, replacement of common area to the homeowners. Okay? Let's say that that's the case. That doesn't answer whether the HOA is going to be responsible for repairing the component in question in this case, right? Or whether water intrusion could have been avoided by normal maintenance or some reasonable steps to have been taken prior to the intrusion, or whether the damage that resulted from the water intrusion could have been minimized or reduced or even eliminated if they had acted in a timely fashion after you notified them of the water intrusion. Right. Those are all really important factors that come into play and that have nothing to do with walls in, walls out.
Fact intensive too. So
very fact intensive.
Yeah.
If you take nothing else from this part of the podcast, take this. Whenever you hear someone explain responsibility using as a shortcut the phrase studs in or studs out or walls out, stop the conversation, force them to point to the CC&Rs. Where in the CC&Rs are you getting that? That's all you got to do.
Yeah.
Okay? Where in the CC&Rs are you getting that? If it's nowhere, then it's the default rules in the civil code, and then you can say, okay, so you can't show me either because it doesn't exist. So now let me tell you what the law is. You open up 475 and say common area here, exclusive use common area here, and separate interest here. Now let's talk about what isn't covered in either of those. Who's responsible for my damage? Okay? Different analysis. Okay? Now, let's talk about, and we're getting to the end of part one, let's talk about a homeowner's obligations after discovery. So after a homeowner determines, ooh, we have a water intrusion. That sucks. Let's act. What do you got to do? Because not all water intrusions are going to be treated the same. Homeowner conduct plays a large role immediately upon discovery of water intrusion and what happens in the hours, days, or weeks following the water intrusion. Now, it should go without saying that there is a meaningful difference between a water intrusion event that's actually caused by the homeowner and a water intrusion event that's not caused by the homeowner. So, i.e., it's caused by a neighbor or by the HOA or by an act of God. Okay?
Or unknown, but it's certainly clear that it's not you.
Right.
Yep.
Either one.
Yep.
Whatever it is. I gave you the three most common examples. He gave you a fourth. Okay? So let's consider two scenarios. First one's an easy one. I'll let you take this once I deliver the scenario.
Okay.
In the first scenario, you go upstairs to fill your bathtub in the master bathroom. So you're going to have a nice sudsy soap bath or bubble bath. Okay? You leave the stopper in. You get distracted by a phone call. You go downstairs and you're on the phone for an hour. And all of a sudden you notice water coming down through your ceiling and even maybe some of the walls, and you know your living room or your den, wherever you are, is right under your master bath. Okay, now you immediately go, oh my God, and you run upstairs, and now there's water everywhere. And you go and you shut your water off and you unplug your tub. Okay, but it's too late. Water's gone everywhere. Okay, responsibility for the repair, whether you're in a condo or a single family home, who's responsible for repairing the components that are damaged?
In that scenario, it's you, the homeowner. You're the cause of it. You're responsible for it. It's within your unit and property. Right. And arguably, if it exceeds beyond that, you're the cause.
Well, I'm going to get to that in the next. All right.
You're responsible.
So you're responsible for not only repairing any damage to the real property, the drywall, the whatever, but also you're going to be responsible for damage to your own personal property. That goes without saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, let's say the water not only affected your unit, but then made its way, because water does with gravity, made its way into the downstairs neighbor, into their unit.
Yeah.
Okay. And affected the real property, affected the common area that the HOA would normally be responsible for repairing, replacing, or maintaining. Who's going to be responsible for repair, replacement, or maintaining of that common area in this scenario? Who?
The responsibility relating to the costs, it's you who are the causing homeowner. The HOA may engage its vendor to make repairs to common area components.
But you'll pay for it.
That's
right. Yep. You're going to pay for all of it. And you're going to pay for if in this scenario that I gave you, I would call that negligence on the part of the homeowner. And so any damage to your neighbor's Aunt Marge armoire or rug or whatever is also going to be your responsibility. Now, hopefully you have insurance that will cover that. If you don't, that's a big matzo ball.
Yeah.
Because that's going to be six figures. Okay? Probably. Okay? But if you have proper insurance, if you have adequate insurance, that should be covered. Okay, so hopefully it doesn't come out of your own pocket. It might raise your rates. You could get canceled, have to find somebody else, whatever, but it should be covered. Okay, if you've done your job in securing proper insurance, it should be covered. But you're going to be responsible for real property, personal property, common area, exclusive use, doesn't matter. You were negligent and you caused it all, you're responsible. Now we'll get to the second scenario, which is the more common one if we're being truthful. And that is a homeowner notices water coming through their ceiling, baseboards, or walls, and there's no obvious source at all. Okay? They didn't do anything to cause it. Nothing. They don't know where the water's coming from. It could be coming from a roof, depending if it's coming from up here. Or let's say they're on the second floor of 3 floors. It's coming from their ceiling. It could be coming from the roof and making its way through the 3rd floor in the walls and then migrating from the wall to your ceiling and down through your ceiling. Or it could be because your neighbor did the whole bathtub thing, okay? Or their pipe to their toilet burst or whatever. You don't know the source of this scenario, okay? So in that scenario, it could be a common area pipe. It could be a separate interest pipe. It could be the roof. It could be a whole variety of things. Endless, okay? In that situation, the analysis of the damages and responsibilities are going to be completely separate from what was the case in this first scenario that Sam talked about. In this second scenario, the homeowner's obligation shifts very, very quickly to prompt notice, documentation, and mitigation.
Exactly.
Okay. Yep. Obviously, when your bathtub has leaked, let's say you're not a single family home. If it's a single family home and your 2nd story bathtub in your master bath leaked, left it on, it leaked down to your 1st floor, you don't have to notify your neighbors. It's not going to migrate over. You just have to take care of it. You're on your own. But in a connected housing, if you've got somebody underneath you, it might actually migrate its way down the walls. In addition to your ceiling, water might have split and is coming down here in addition to here. So you have an obligation, even in that first scenario, to notify, document, and mitigate to the extent that you're permitted. You're not going to be permitted to open up common area walls because you don't have that power. So that's where your documentation and notification comes in. But in our second scenario here, you definitely have prompt notice. Prompt meaning immediately upon
Time
notice.
is of the essence.
Within a minute, okay? Documentation, mitigation. The homeowner has to report the intrusion immediately in writing, okay? Request immediate investigation. So my second scenario, you have no idea what the origin is, okay? Could be common area, could be your neighbor, could be an act of God. We don't know, okay? And they have a step to immediately mitigate. Just to be clear, I hope you all understand, in my opinion, every water intrusion event is an emergency.
Yeah.
Because minutes matter with water intrusion. The more time that goes by, the more damage can occur in terms of not only actual damage, but in terms of even potential mold growth, whatever. Water intrusions, water leaks are always an emergency and should be handled immediately.
And as an extension to that, call their emergency line.
If they have one.
Document it in writing for sure, certainly, but then also notify the emergency line.
I would also say I would do the call first, then the documentation after.
Yeah.
Call first because it's quicker. And then if you don't get through to anybody, or if you do, either way, your next thing is a written documentation saying, either I just got off the phone with the emergency hotline, or I called and left a message on the emergency hotline. I have experienced a water intrusion event. I've got water coming from my ceiling in my in my den downstairs. It's not coming from in my unit as far as I know. So I have no idea what the origin is, but get somebody out here ASAP immediately. Now, if you don't hear back within a couple of hours, I don't care if it's the middle of the night, you can take action to mitigate, to at least stop the water. Okay? Turn off the water at its source. If that works, then at least, if you can turn off the water to your unit and it stops, it's coming from somewhere in your unit. If that doesn't work, then you call a 24-hour whatever, because you got to stop the water. Okay, you give the HOA a chance, but you don't give them more than an hour. That's my opinion. Okay, I'm not talking about repairs. I'm talking about stopping the water. That's the most important thing. Okay, the responsibility to identify the source and address the failed components does not magically become the HOA's problem or your problem simply because let's talk about your problem. It's not automatically your problem just because it appeared inside your unit. If an HOA tells you that, then they're wrong. So just because you're noticing the results in your unit doesn't tell you anything about the origin. We talked about that. Origin's different. So the obligation in connected housing is going to fall on the HOA to investigate immediately, because only the HOA has the right to open up common area stuff, and they can coordinate with you to come into your unit to look at your stuff too, to see what's going on. If the common area opening up doesn't show anything, the next step for them is say, hey, can we come into your unit? And they'll do this to the neighbor too. They'll do it to everybody connected to you probably. If they don't figure it out in the first place, they'll go to the second place.
And speaking of which, the right to enter your unit and cooperation is recommended.
100%. No, it's not recommended. It's mandatory. If you refuse entry because you don't like your HOA and you prevent them from mitigating, or you prevent them from identifying the origin, then you're you're shooting yourself in the foot.
That's a problem.
Makes no sense. Don't do that. We have people that do that. I will not allow them in my home. Well, then you're on your own. You're not going to get any justice. You're not going to get repairs. You're not going to get anything because you're not cooperating. Got to cooperate in good faith. Okay? This is why, this point we're making is why identifying origin is so critically important. Okay? An HOA that jumps straight to the go through your insurance, they're not doing the right thing. That's illegal. They should be determining origin first and mitigating second. And then they might suggest call your insurance, issue a claim, we're going to do likewise. And then let the insurance companies work that out too. Okay? Often the master policy people will work with your people on your SO or your HO6 policy. That's okay too. They all might work together to figure out origin, or to figure out, once they've determined what origin is, to figure out whether or not allocation of damages, whether or not, and we're going to get to this last, whether or not negligence was involved or willful misconduct, bad faith. Okay. Your conduct matters though. You don't notify, you don't mitigate, or you don't document. You're just shooting yourself in the foot. The first two, the notification and mitigation, are mandatory obligations. Documenting is just a good idea. Okay. Now, we come to the last portion of today's part one, and that is negligence, board conduct, and why this question, or why determining this question, changes everything. Okay? Up to this point, we focused on classification, source, and repair responsibility. So those three things, right? Classification, origin or source, and repair, usually repair or replacement responsibility. Maintain isn't going to be a factor. Once water intrusion occurs, there's nothing to maintain. There's something to fix or replace, whichever's the case. Now we're going to talk about the issue that most often determines whether an HOA becomes liable for damages it otherwise might not be liable for. Let's take the easy case where they otherwise are liable. HOA is negligent, and it causes a water intrusion, and it causes damage to common area and your personal property. They're going to be responsible for repair or replacement of the common area hardware, the components, including the real property, and they're going to be responsible to fix or replace, or give you the, if it can't be replaced, give you the value or the worth of Aunt Marge's armoire or your antique Oriental carpet. Okay? That's the easy case. They're negligent, or they did it in bad faith because they're horrible people and they don't like you. They're responsible. Problem solved. Okay? But let's talk about how do you make those determinations, and what constitutes, when does negligence, when can it rear its head to affect that damages issue? Okay? Because we told you at the beginning, unless your CC&Rs say otherwise, just because an HOA accepts responsibility for, let's say, just because your CC&Rs state that where the origin is common area and the HOA accepts its obligation to repair or replace the common area, doesn't mean that damage to your personal stuff is the HOA's responsibility. We said that several times today. That does change when there's negligent and willful conduct, which is where we are now. That's when that analysis changes. So, negligence, or in some cases, or even worse, willful misconduct, is often the bridge between routine water intrusion events and real liability for your actual damages to your personal property. Contrary to what a lot of homeowners might believe, it's not automatic. You've got to have that wrongful conduct or negligence. So let's talk about how that manifests. In a case where a pipe just fails, common area pipe, let's presume it's common area pipe. Common area pipe just fails with no prior warning. Okay? That's probably not going to, there's no element of negligence there or willful misconduct. It just failed.
You said no prior warning. Yep.
Things do fail sometimes before the end of their useful lives.
Yeah.
Now, let's say that pipe's useful life expired 2 or 3 years ago based on your reserve studies, right? And nothing's been done to replace it. Or let's say it's never been maintained, assuming maintenance is an obligation there, then that could change the analysis because that's not reasonable.
Or the same exact pipe elsewhere within the community has repeatedly failed, just not in your building or your unit.
Right. And they don't go check.
They're on notice that the same one with the same lifespan or failures will likely, rear its head elsewhere, so they failed to act.
Agreed. That would manifest also if they found out in a separate unit that the builder, let's say, put in some faulty piping. It's very, very likely that if they put faulty piping behind the master bedroom in that condo, then they did the same piping behind the master bedroom in the other condo. And I'd say they have an obligation to open up the wall and make sure, is that the same piping? If so, we need to replace that too before a water failure or water intrusion occurs. So that would be negligent, but also whether or not they fail to maintain or they fail to replace when it should have been replaced. That also. Okay. Again, now in these examples, we're talking about negligence that occurred before a water intrusion event. So the water intrusion event occurs and you look back at what they didn't do in the past. That's one form of negligence. Or if it's worse, they do it on purpose because they know it'll screw you, then that would be willful misconduct, let's say. That's the bad faith, right? But what happens if none of that pre-water intrusion negligence occurred, but there was post-water intrusion negligence that occurred? Okay, so just to be clear, pre-loss negligence includes situations where an HOA ignores known defects, that's the one you brought up, right? Or they've deferred maintenance improperly or negligently, or they received repeated complaints from you of minor little water intrusions that were no big deal, but those always grow, right?
Moisture detected, they failed to investigate or make an inquiry.
Yeah, not active leaking, but moisture.
Now it's flooding,
Right. you watch your paint bubble up a little bit, but there's no active water.
Right.
Versus water is like you have to put the bucket underneath, right? They ignore that, or they fail to act on that. Or the reserve study says, hey, useful life is over next year. You guys need to replace certain aspects, and they don't replace those. Those are the pre-water intrusion types of negligence that would then make the HOA liable for your personal property damage. Now let's talk about post-loss negligence, post-intrusion negligence. They're not, they've maintained properly, or it was an act of God, or it was just a freak accident, whatever. Not responsible. They're not negligent for the water intrusion event occurring. They have no role in that, but they sit on it for weeks. They don't do anything. They don't mitigate. They don't get somebody out there in time. They don't open the walls to dry it out. If it was a continuous source of water, they do nothing to stop the water.
Now you have risk of mold.
Whatever. Unreasonable delays after notice. Remember, all this starts upon notice. You can't expect them to know that the water intrusion occurred inside your unit if you never told them. So that assumes that you've done that. But once you've done that, they don't act in a reasonable time frame to stop it and repair it or mitigate additional damage. That is post-water intrusion negligence. And to the extent you can show that you suffer damage to your personal property that would not have been suffered had they acted immediately, they will be responsible for that part. Okay?
Exactly. Yep.
So both pre and post negligence or willful misconduct are very important. That's a determination you make after origin, after classification, after all that. Now you decide, okay? The distinction is critical when it comes to your personal property. That's the only place it's really critical, but that's pretty critical, okay? In many cases, personal property damages aren't going to be recoverable from the HOA. You're going to have to go to your HO6 policy or your insurance policy and say, I lost a $50,000 and you have to prove that you had that. But my $50,000 card collection, baseball card collection, was ruined. It's moldy now because you don't have it in those cool little plastic things.
Right.
Okay, moldy. It's ruined. You can't ever sell them. They're worthless. That's your personal property. You better have insurance unless we've established that the HOA has liability. Okay. Negligence analysis is where act of God arguments fall apart.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't, especially in the post water intrusion negligence incidents where act of God's irrelevant because nobody's disputing that the leak occurred through no intentional act by anybody, but through an act of God. It's how the HOA handled things after you notified them that made them negligent and thus liable to you for your damage. Now remember, it'll only be liable for your damage where you show that that damage was worsened by the failure to act. Okay, if it's a scenario where as soon as the water intrusion occurred, let's say we're dealing with a water intrusion event that was not a result of negligence. No pre-water intrusion negligence here. And as soon as the damage occurs, to your baseball cards, you pulled the cards out and brought them to your brother's house. Okay, then your HOA sits on things and doesn't fix for a long time. The HOAs, just because they were post-intrusion negligent, isn't going to make them liable to you for the damage to your cards, because none of that negligence affected any damage to your cards.
Yeah.
You pulled it out before their negligence occurred. Okay, so it has to be the difference, the damage difference. Okay, so the only time I guess would be fair to say the HOA is going to be responsible for all your personal property damage is if it was either pre-negligence or pre-water intrusion negligence or willful misconduct, or there was very minimal damage from the resulting water damage. There was minimal damage from the water intrusion, and the real damage only occurred because of the failure to repair, replace, or mitigate. And that's where the damage actually happened. Then you'd get all your damages. Okay. Bottom line, that analysis, now you understand at least why the damage analysis is very different from all the rest of the analysis before. In a lot of scenarios, HOAs got responsibility for all the repairs and replacements of common area components and even exclusive use common area components that were affected by the water intrusion, and no liability for personal property damage to your stuff. Okay? So with that said, I'm looking to close out part one.
Okay.
In part two, we're going to build on the foundation by addressing insurance, deductibles, relocation, mold and remediation, delay, denial, and specific legal claims that arise from all the conduct we've been talking about with bad HOAs.
Yeah.
Okay. If you like this episode, please hit the like button. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our channel, HOA Hell. If you'd like to leave a question or make a comment, please do so. We like to read those. Until next time, folks, have a great day.